All right, so just a really quick review for anybody who's watching this who missed class. You have your approved source lists for historical context, cultural context, and cultural context, historical context, and the biography of the author. Those approved source lists are here, as well as a review of how to put together a source paragraph. In your discussion board this week, you are saying which short story you're working with, what your working thesis is, and which of these approved sources you've decided to adopt and work with. In your responses to peers, you are suggesting quotes from the original short story that might support your peer's thesis. Okay, and then our assignment for this week, just to review, is to write a thesis paragraph for the essay, and 2 paragraphs of close reading from the short story itself that support your thesis. So just using the short story itself, you're supporting your thesis. And now we're going to kind of talk about thesis statements. The thesis statements here are kind of settled, right? And some of you hit on them and some of you missed them. And I'm actually going to do a stop share because I just want to talk about this and see your faces. Okay, so let's get ready to take a few notes, because the theses and the main ideas for these stories, there's actually kind of a right answer and a wrong answer. Okay, and a lot of you hit on them, and a lot of you did a great job articulating them and getting them said in a way that makes sense, and that was really good practice. But let's go down through them. Let's start with the Alice Walker. The Alice Walker thesis statement is about the importance of cultural artifacts in African American women's history. And Alice Walker is asserting here that cultural artifacts like quilts have an importance in African American history. Okay, and she's doing that through her character of Dee, but she's also saying that their importance as artifacts doesn't necessarily trump their importance as a family item, right? So whether you agree with Maggie or agree with Dee, what you're talking about in that thesis statement is either I agree with Maggie and Mom that this cultural artifact, while it might be important, is still a living document and should be kept alive and used, or you agree with Dee and you say, hey, this cultural artifact should be in a museum because it's an important piece of African American history. Now, I don't care who you side with, but that's at the crux of this piece. And your thesis has to either take Maggie's side or Dee's side on that issue. Does that make sense? Hot dog. Let's talk about Amy Tan. This one's a little bit harder, but you are talking about a thesis statement that says that the cultural gap between an immigrant parent and a first-generation child is extreme and can damage that relationship. Okay, that the cultural differences experienced by the first-generation immigrant that are different from the immigrant parents can cause a rift in a family, right? Because the life is so different for somebody growing up in American culture versus growing up in Chinese culture and moving to American culture. It can cause a rift in the family. And that's what you're working on there, because that's what Amy Tan is talking about through her whole novel, The Joy Luck Club. Okay? If you're working in Ellison, you are talking about voice, and you are talking about the kind of degradation that the main character is willing to face in order to have his voice heard. Okay, and you're developing a thesis about that. That's the main idea, y'all, right? That main character is willing to put up with massive amounts of degradation to get his voice heard, and to be able to speak for himself and for his people, for his brothers and sisters. Okay, to get that voice heard. If we are talking about Charlotte Perkins Gilman, it is 100% very clear that she is trying to prove that the rest cure did not work as a means of treating postpartum depression. And if you've missed that, I need you to go back and read the story and watch our discussion about it. It's very specific. And if you're missing that, you're missing the point of the story. Okay? She's trying to prove that the rest cure was a bad idea, was a bad plan. Okay, how are you feeling? How many of you feel kind of like you hit 2 or 3 of those at least? You got those. I agree. I think most of you hit 2 or 3 of those. Now, some of you got stuck in topic. Some of you were stuck in, this is about racism. Yeah, I know it's about racism. What's he trying to say about racism, right? I know this is about the immigrant experience. What about the immigrant experience are they trying to prove? So in those cases, I need you to push more toward main idea than topic. You're stuck in topic. I need you to get to main idea and maybe go back and review that video on topic versus main idea. When you're thinking about main idea, which is what leads you to thesis, you're thinking about, okay, the moral of the story is what? Now, especially with Ellison, you can take a slightly different view. But the thesis that I was talking about is what you're going to find in the literary criticism when you get there. Okay, remember I have a doctorate in this, and I've read all the literary criticism that's out there on these authors. So I'm trying to steer you in the direction where you won't have to rewrite your essay when you find the literary criticism. Okay? Trying to do a little bit of hand holding here so that you don't get to the literary criticism and go, oh, crud, I have to rewrite my article because they're all talking about something else. Okay? Because we don't want that to happen to you. Or I can't find any articles supporting my thesis. And it's because you took a thesis that nobody else has thought of. And that would be great if you're doing graduate level work and trying to come up with your own thesis and support it using only primary texts. But that's incredibly hard. And I'm asking you to just kind of do a research essay. So let me boss you around a little. I promise it'll help. Okay. Good. All right. Okay, questions about this. What do we have for questions? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep, you're going to write a thesis paragraph, and I'm going to go over that thesis paragraph instructions again. A thesis paragraph for the whole essay, which is hard. You might need to write an outline to do it well. Might need to jot down an outline to do it well. And then you're going to support that thesis paragraph with 2 paragraphs of close reading from the short story you've chosen to work with. Okay? So, in other words, if you're working with Ellison and you're talking about how much degradation he's willing to put up with to find his voice and to be able to speak, you're doing a close reading where you show the degradation and what he's willing to do and prove that it was all in order to be able to say his piece. And you're going to use 2 paragraphs of showing that happening in the text. Okay? If you're siding with D and saying that quilt is an artifact of African American history and should be in a museum, you're going to pull quotes from the story that show the importance of the quilt to D and what she's trying to explain to her family about it. And back that up. If you're taking Maggie's side or Mama's side, you're going to have to pull the quotes that prove that Mama has a point and that it's a living document and she doesn't appreciate it, and hanging it on the wall isn't what's meant to be done with it, right? So you're going to have to take a side there on that story. In Amy Tan, if you're talking about it, you got to find those pieces where the mom and the daughter are not connecting, right? Where the mom is living and trying to live with an old ideology and not understanding her current culture, and the daughter is understanding the current culture but isn't understanding her mom's culture and her mom's goals for her, right? And try to get at those disparities. If you're working with Gilman, you're just trying to show that the rest cure wasn't working. Does that make sense? Okay. You may, with Gilman, need to spend your first close reading paragraph establishing that she has postpartum depression and is being treated for it and isn't really in a vacation home. So if you're working with Gilman, your first paragraph is probably proving that she's undergoing treatment of some sort. And then the second one is proving that it doesn't work, right? So that's what you're working on this week, is getting that thesis stated well and in the middle of a thesis paragraph, and then supporting that with evidence from the text. Just the short story text, nothing else yet. We'll talk about how to build the other paragraphs soon. We haven't built them yet, okay? Okay, I'm going to do a screen share and make sure that we go over that thesis paragraph again one more time together, because it's here. And while it's recording, and make sure we go over it. So a thesis paragraph has these basic jobs: raise the subject naturally, get the reader's attention and set the scene, state your thesis, share your plan for the essay, and get the reader ready for the first body paragraph. That's going to be in any essay ever. It's going to follow that pattern, okay? But I've translated that for you a little bit for this particular project. We start with the topic, okay? And this is where, if you've been observing to me that this story is about racism, or this story is about the Black nationalist movement, or this story is about cultural artifacts that belong to a family, or if it's about immigration and immigrating families, that's where you talk about that. You're going to start with the topic. And you're going to start with the topic like, hey, racism has been the subject of a lot of literature. It's a big deal. It's been a big deal for a long time. Or, hey, immigration is something that a lot of authors have written about. You know, just starting talking about the topic as naturally as you can, okay? Then you're going to make that connection between the topic and the author. Hey, there's an author that writes about racism, or here's an author, Amy Tan, who writes about the immigration experience, right? So first you write about the immigration experience in general, and then you say, hey, here's Amy Tan writing about it in this short story. Here's what the short story is about, okay? So that's probably like 6 sentences or so, maybe 2 or 3 for each of those jobs. Be patient with those jobs. Then you're going to state your thesis clearly and directly and underline it. Okay, and we've been working on those, and that's where I think Daniel's eager to get that feedback. We're also working on that feedback in discussion boards, so the more you can reply to your peers on this one before Sunday, the more help that they'll get on that thesis statement before Sunday. Okay, and then it says to set out your plan for the essay. Now, usually you say what your 3 examples are going to be. You did that on the poetry essay. You were like, I'm going to discuss this poem and this poem and this poem. Here it's a little harder, right? This is where you are going to establish that you're going to do a close reading. It's also where you establish that you're going to discuss the history of the text, the cultural context of the text, and a little bit about the biography, to all prove that this is what the author was up to. So you might need to spend a few, like maybe 3 or 4 sentences on it. But this is where you let us know that this is a research analysis that talks about the historical and cultural context of the piece. Okay. You might also mention that you're going to deal with some literary criticism. So this is kind of where you let your reader know in a few sentences that this is going to be a research essay. Okay. Now, please don't spend 5 sentences telling me one at a time about every source you're going to use. I don't think that's going to make for very good reading in your thesis paragraph, but this is where you establish that it's a research essay, okay, and what kinds of research you're going to deal with. And then you get us ready for that close reading to start. And a good way to do that is just to simply say, let's look at this phenomenon, as we see it in the story itself. Let's start with the story itself, which is always the best place to start, right? Let's see how Alice Walker deals with the Pan-African movement, right? Let's see how Alice Walker deals with cultural artifacts, right? Let's take a look at how crazy Gilman's character gets, right? And just get us ready to dive into that short story. And then the close reading paragraphs are choosing quotes that you think show in action what your thesis says is there, okay? Showing it to me from the text, okay? I'm going to stop the share because this is there for you to read. Do you have questions about that? No questions about that whatsoever? Are you sure? I'm definitely going to stop recording because that's insane.